Before Trooper Dana Holt vanished without a trace, she drew a map. Not for her patrol route, but of something darker. On it 5 names, 5 women. Each one gone, each one swallowed by the same stretch of road. She never told anyone what she'd found. No report, no warning. Just a quiet final transmission. 10 to 10, I'll be out of service for a while. 4 years later, they pulled her cruiser from the lake. And the question wasn't how she got there. It was what she was chasing when the road ran out. The water was still that morning. Not glass-like, but thick, molasses dark, as if it had grown used to keeping secrets. Lake Ravine was like that. Quiet, unremarkable. A long forgotten stretch, tucked behind a crumbling guardrail, where fishermen stopped coming and teenagers stopped daring. And yet, just below the surface, something watched. Not alive, not waiting. Just there, a silent monument to a moment lost in time. The first thing spotted was the glint. It wasn't sunlight, the clouds hadn't broken in days. It was duller than that, like something reflecting memory rather than light. A shape not quite natural, not quite mechanical, shrouded in silt and algae. Before we dive deeper into the mystery unearthed beneath the waters of Lake Ravine and the unanswered questions surrounding Trooper Dana Holt's final drive, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue uncovering the forgotten, the silenced, and the stories time tried to erase. Every subscription is a step closer to giving voice to those who never got to speak their truth. A small gesture from you means everything to the work we do. Thank you. The diver paused, bubbles rising past his mask as he hovered near the lake bed. He reached forward, fingers brushing rusted steel, and there it was, the unmistakable curve of a wheel well. A license plate, half-eaten by corrosion. A door frame, its handle missing, the glass long shattered. And there, behind the steering wheel, a uniform still clinging to bones. 4 years earlier, Trooper Dana Holt vanished during a routine patrol on a rainy November night. She left the station just after 1 a.m., logged her route, and was never heard from again. Her cruiser, her service weapon, her radio gone. The initial search spanned 200 miles and dozens of officers. Bloodhounds, helicopters, dead ends. They found nothing. No trace. Not a single piece of evidence, as if she had been plucked from the earth like smoke in a crosswind. Until now. As the recovery crew hoisted the vehicle from the lake, silence fell across the shore. Spectators, a few locals, a few off-duty officers, and one retired sergeant who'd spent years chasing ghosts, stood in the rain, faces drawn. The vehicle emerged slowly, creaking like a coffin long buried. It was hers. Still marked with the insignia of the State Patrol, faded but defiant. Still bearing her number, 4032, stenciled near the rear fender. The windows were clouded with years of grime, but through the windshield, you could just make out the outline of a woman still seated behind the wheel. She had been there the whole time. While theories multiplied, while rumors ran wild, while her mother refused to change the locks in case Dana came home one night, while her photo aged gently on the mantel, a smiling portrait of certainty eroded by grief, while the world moved on. There was no splash, no sign, no tire tracks leading down the slope. Just a car that slid into the dark one night and never came back up. And a woman who vanished without a sound. The questions came fast, but answers resisted the light. Why that road? Why no signs of a crash? Why did it take 4 years to find her when the lake had always been there, unhidden, unguarded? What was she doing near Lake Ravine in the first place, a place not listed on her patrol route, not even close? No one spoke her name aloud that day, but everyone knew. The lake had been whispering it all along. Dana. There was something sacred in the moment, not peace, but a kind of weight, a knowing, as if the trees bent slightly toward the water, as if the wind held its breath. The vehicle hung in the air, dripping time. Mud and moss spilled from its undercarriage like memories reluctantly resurfacing. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of the telling. And so, we begin not with the night she disappeared, but with the day she was found, because sometimes the truth doesn't start with a scream, or a clue, or a chase. Sometimes, it starts with silence, with a shadow beneath still water, with a name that never left the lake. Dana Holt was the kind of officer people remembered, not because she demanded attention, but because she carried herself like someone who understood the weight of the badge not as a symbol of authority, but as a promise. At 27, she had already earned 3 commendations for service under pressure, including one for talking a young veteran out of ending his life on the edge of an overpass. She never mentioned it afterward. Didn't like to be called a hero, said it was part of the job. But the people who worked alongside her, the ones who shared stale coffee and long midnight patrols, they remembered. They remembered her laugh, quiet and warm. They remembered the way she kept spare granola bars in her glove box for the homeless she might come across. And they remembered her eyes, sharp, observant, a little weary, like she'd seen more than she let on. Her official portrait showed her in uniform, standing in front of a state patrol flag, expression neutral. But in person, she was rarely still. Always moving, always working. She'd requested the overnight shifts, said she preferred the quiet, preferred the solitude. Said it helped her think. No one argued. Dana was one of the good ones, steady, thoughtful, and stubborn in the best way. If she said something was off, you listened. When she went missing in late 1999, it made the evening news. Her photo, windblown hair, slight smile was plastered across flyers, community boards, and gas station windows. Press conferences were held. Her commanding officer choked up in front of the cameras, recalling the last time he saw her walking out to her cruiser, adjusting her radio strap like she always did. Her name echoed across scanner channels and police radios. Holt 4032. Last known location, Route 7, mile marker 212. Estimated time, 1:46 a.m. And then, as days turned into weeks, her name began to fade. At first, it was just the rotation of headlines. Other stories took precedence. A fire in a nursing home, a string of carjackings, a mayoral scandal. Then the posters began to weather. Corners curling, tape yellowing, rain streaks blurring the ink. Her photo, once so familiar, became background noise. Something passed by, not seen. The public moved on. The world always does. But inside the department, a quiet grief set in. Patrol cars rolled past mile 212 a little slower. Radios stayed tuned to Channel 4 a little longer. Her desk remained untouched. There were theories, of course. She left. She cracked under the weight. She was taken. None of them made sense to those who knew her. Dana didn't run. Dana didn't break. And Dana never, ever missed a call. Her mother gave interviews, pleaded into microphones with the kind of pain that makes strangers look away. She would have called, she said once, voice shaking. If she could have, she would have called. That clip aired twice, then never again. Years passed. Her name stopped being spoken in morning briefings. New cadets joined the force who didn't recognize her photo. Holt 4032 was marked as unresolved, pending further evidence. A placeholder, a case number, a name in a drawer. But the people who knew her, the ones who still passed her street on the way home, who still paused at the gas station where her flyer had once been, they hadn't forgotten. They just didn't have anything new to hold on to. Only a name, slowly slipping from the airwaves, and the silence she left behind. It was still dark when the call came in, a short, clipped message from dispatch to the early shift. Patrol Unit 4032 hadn't checked in. The log showed her final report at 1:46 a.m., a standard all clear from her position near Route 7, just south of the state line. It was nothing unusual. Dana had wrapped her final round of checks and was expected to head home by 2 a.m., maybe a little later if she stopped for coffee like she sometimes did. But by 6, there had been no sign of her, no radio contact, no morning shift handoff, and by then, something unspoken had already begun to settle into the bones of those who knew her best. Dana Holt didn't forget to check in. She didn't lose track of time. She was precise, maybe even rigid, but not careless, never careless. The sun was just beginning to rise when Officer Mercer found the cruiser. It was parked at a rest stop off Old Cinder Road, a lonely pull-off rarely used except by truckers too tired to continue, or locals who needed a place to cry or argue where no one would hear. The car was locked, the windows fogged faintly from the chill. From a distance, it might have looked like she was inside, dozing through a break. But when Mercer approached, flashlight in hand, the truth crept in like cold air through a cracked door. The driver's seat was empty, no sign of a struggle, no keys in the ignition. The cabin was neat, too neat. Dana's clipboard sat on the passenger seat, notes from her last stop half scribbled in blue ink. Her coffee cup, the one with the small chip near the lip, sat untouched in the holder, still 3/4 full. Her jacket remained draped across the back of the seat, as if she'd meant to return any minute, but she never did. They swept the area by noon. K9 units traced a faint scent to the edge of the woods behind the rest stop, but the trail died in soft mud. No tracks, no drag marks, no signs of running. The ground simply stopped remembering her. A few hours later, helicopters buzzed low, searching the tree line and nearby roads. Officers widened the radius, knocking on doors, checking traffic cams. Nothing, no witnesses, no calls to dispatch, no red flags in her logs. Dana Holt had finished her shift, turned off her radio, and then she was gone. Her home was untouched. Her bed made. Alarm set for 8 a.m. Like always. In the fridge, a half-eaten dinner still wrapped in foil. Her cat, Fig, circled the doorway anxiously when her mother unlocked the door using the spare key hidden under the porch rock. Everything was in its place, except Dana. The official record lists her as missing at 7:12 a.m., but everyone close to her knew it happened before that. The moment she turned off her radio. The moment she veered from her expected path and pulled into that rest stop. Why she stopped remains a question that would echo for years. There were no emergency calls in the area, no flagged vehicles, no sign of a pursuit. Just a quiet night and a final, ordinary moment, a blink in time when something shifted forever. And somewhere in that silence, Dana Holt vanished. No one heard a scream. No one saw her leave. It was as if the darkness had swallowed her whole and kept its lips shut tight. The only sound left was static on a silent channel, and the soft click of a pen resting beside a half-written report that would never be finished. The frost came early that year. By morning, the grass around the rest stop was stiff and silver, the ground hardened under a thin crust of ice. It should have preserved the evidence, made tracks clearer, easier to follow. But when the first search team arrived, boots crunching over the pale earth, they found only confusion. The cruiser still sat idle, locked, untouched, since Officer Mercer had marked it with yellow tape hours earlier. And just beyond the rear of the vehicle, faint impressions, a set of footprints leading toward the tree line. Not running, not staggering, just walking. They followed the prints until they disappeared in a patch of thawed soil, where the sun had warmed the ground just enough to swallow them. There was no second set, no drag marks, no sign that she had struggled, or been chased, or carried. Just those solitary steps, as though she had wandered into the woods of her own accord, and then vanished into thin air. Investigators spread out in a fan pattern. Dogs circled the perimeter, handlers shouting Dana's name into the silence, again and again, until the woods echoed back nothing but their own voices. Helicopters swept overhead, the rhythmic chop of blades adding urgency to the stillness below. Volunteers joined within hours, neighbors, troopers, retired veterans who had never met Dana but had heard her name on the morning news. They scoured ravines, peered into culverts, turned over every stone and shadow. But the woods offered no answers, just more silence, thick and unmoved. Inside the command van, detectives combed through her radio logs, hoping for something, anything that might explain her decision to stop at such an isolated location. She hadn't reported trouble. No calls for backup, no request for roadside assistance or reports of suspicious vehicles. The logs showed a routine patrol, clear roads, nothing flagged. And then, at 1:46 a.m., a final transmission. "Unit 4032, she'd said, voice steady. 10 to 10, I'll be out of service for a while." That was it. No location update, no reason given, no follow-up. Just those words, calm, controlled, and completely out of character. A 10 to 10 code typically marked a personal break, off-duty or off the grid. But Dana had never used it during patrol. She was meticulous. She didn't take unscheduled breaks, especially not in the middle of nowhere. They replayed the clip dozens of times, listening for inflection, hesitation, background noise. Nothing gave. No static, no voices in the background, no hint of urgency. Just the code, spoken plainly, and then her signal disappeared. The rest stop had no security cameras. The nearest traffic cam was 2 miles up the road, and its footage revealed nothing but passing headlights, none of them hers. Her cruiser hadn't moved since the moment she parked it. And by the time the sun rose and the frost began to melt, so had the only trail they had. People talked, quietly, at first. Officers glanced at each other during shift changes, wondering if she'd meant something else, if she'd seen something, if the code had been a signal, a warning. But no one knew. Dana had left no clues, no notes, no calls home. Just those footprints into the woods, and a voice on the radio that slipped through the static like a ghost. And somewhere beyond that last trace of frost, the world held its breath, waiting for a woman who would not return. It didn't take long before Dana Holt's name was spoken alongside others' names that had faded into the background before hers joined them. Her disappearance, chilling as it was, wasn't the first. In fact, it had become the latest entry in a quiet ledger of vanishing women. A grim and growing pattern that no one had wanted to see until it could no longer be ignored. In the year leading up to Dana's disappearance, late 1998 through the end of 1999, 4 other women had gone missing within a 100-mile radius. Each case was handled independently. Different counties, different departments, different circumstances. No connection, no shared geography, no single thread to tie them together. But when Dana, a state trooper, vanished without explanation or trace, the pattern shifted from coincidence to something more sinister. People began looking backward. First, there was Janice Marlowe, 22, a waitress from Brookfield. She was last seen walking home from the closing shift at a roadside diner. Her car was found parked outside her apartment, keys still inside. Her purse was discovered 2 days later in a drainage ditch 15 miles away. No one ever figured out how it got there. No one ever found her. Then came Alyssa Drake, 38. A traveling insurance agent who disappeared somewhere between client visits in Grantham and Lowell. Her last phone call had been to her daughter, just after noon. She said she was stopping for coffee. Her rental car was found abandoned in a gravel turnout near a wooded area. Her briefcase was still in the trunk. Nothing was stolen, nothing was disturbed. It was as if she'd stepped out to stretch her legs and vanished into air. The third was Angela Kepner, 19. A freshman at a community college, she was last seen leaving a party just off campus. Her roommate assumed she'd stayed with friends. It took nearly a week before she was reported missing. By then, the trail was cold, and whatever witnesses might have seen had already forgotten the details. All anyone recalled was that she had seemed happy. Normal. Nothing unusual. And finally, Megan Albright, 41. A single mother working night shifts at a manufacturing plant. She failed to pick up her son from school one afternoon, which had never happened before. Her phone was off, her wallet untouched in her apartment. The police found no signs of forced entry, no signs of distress. Just a vanished life, mid-sentence. Each of these disappearances was investigated, but none gained traction. They didn't ignite public interest the way Dana's did. She was a trooper, after all. She wore the uniform. She was part of the institution, and her loss carried a weight the others somehow didn't. But once the dots were placed on the map, proximity became impossible to dismiss. 5 women. 5 disappearances. All within a year. All within the same corridor of quiet roads, forgotten turnouts, and towns that never made the evening news. There were murmurs. Maybe a serial predator. Maybe an underground network. Maybe something even worse, something systemic. Something covered up. But the cases remained isolated in the files, compartmentalized. One investigator said later, off the record, that it was like looking at pieces of a puzzle that had been cut not to fit. Families gathered at vigils, candles flickering in wind that didn't care about hope. Flyers layered over flyers on community boards, old faces curling beneath new ones. Each woman had a story, a life, a circle of people who waited. And each time one more disappeared, the air grew a little heavier. People drove a little faster through back roads, locked their doors before sundown, looked twice over their shoulders. Dana Holt's disappearance brought attention, but no resolution. And in doing so, it cast a shadow long enough to fall across the forgotten. The unsolved. The missing. The year of vanishing women did not have an official name, nor a file, nor a task force dedicated to connecting its dots. But for those who remember, who still wait, who still walk past the places where the trail went cold, it is a wound that never healed. A whisper in the trees. A question that refuses to be answered. Time has a way of softening sharp edges, but not all wounds respond to its touch. In the years after Dana Holt vanished, the world around her gradually rearranged itself. Patrol cars were repainted. The station she once called home underwent renovations. Faces changed, routines settled. But in the quiet spaces and the places where memory refuses to dim, she remained. Not as a person who could return, but as a question that never left. The case file thickened with paperwork but thinned with purpose. Tips grew fewer, each one more desperate or far-fetched than the last. A sighting in Missouri. A voicemail with heavy breathing. A blurry photograph of a woman with similar eyes walking alone in a desert town. They were all investigated, all dismissed. Eventually, the urgency unraveled. The maps came down. The press conferences stopped. Dana's name stopped showing up in morning briefings. In her absence, silence settled like dust. Her room remained exactly as she had left it. A faded quilt pulled tight over the bed. Books stacked neatly on the nightstand. A photograph of her and her father on a fishing trip, sunburned and laughing, their faces locked forever in summer. Her mother vacuumed once a week, aired it out every other Sunday, and refused to let anyone move a single item. She said it was for when Dana came back. Said that people who returned needed something familiar to step into, but even she stopped opening the door as often. The stillness became its own kind of presence, thick and suffocating. At the department, Dana's name turned into a sort of myth. New recruits heard about her during training, the trooper who vanished during patrol, the officer whose cruiser was found like a ghost ship. They read the file like a cautionary tale. But for those who had worn the uniform beside her, who had shared late shifts and coffee breaks, it wasn't a story. It was a scar. Officer Fields retired 2 years later. Mercer transferred to another district. Lieutenant Owens, who once promised Dana's mother that they would bring her home, stopped making those promises out loud. The weight was too heavy, the silence too long. And then came the rumors. They slipped in through the cracks left by unanswered questions. She ran. She cracked under pressure, she faked it. Suicide, some whispered. Maybe she drove into a lake somewhere, her own choice, her own ending. Others were more cynical. She had enemies, secrets, debts. She got too close to something she shouldn't have. Every theory said more about the people telling it than it did about Dana, and none could be proven, which made them all seem equally possible. Her mother never entertained them. She said Dana had been steady. If she were broken, there would have been signs. If she were scared, she would have called. Dana had always called. She didn't believe her daughter would ever choose silence. But belief became harder to hold as the years stretched on. Anniversaries came and went. Small vigils were held. A candlelight walk around the station one year, a moment of silence during roll call the next. Eventually, those two faded. Life kept moving forward, indifferent to those it left behind. Stillness became a habit, the kind that starts as respect and hardens into resignation. No one expected answers anymore. They just learned how to carry the not knowing, how to glance at the edge of the woods or the bend in the road and feel that same quiet ache, unspoken and unresolved. Dana Holt became a name etched on a plaque, a photograph in a dusty frame, a memory that only lived when spoken. And as fewer people spoke it, she became less a person and more a space and outline of someone once present, now missing, in every sense of the word. Lake Revine was the kind of place you passed without noticing. It didn't announce itself with scenic overlooks or roadside signs. No picnic tables, no trailheads. Just a sullen, sun-starved body of water tucked beneath the low rise of County Route 6, wrapped in trees that never seemed to grow quite right. The kind of lake that felt like it had been forgotten on purpose. Locals drove past it quickly, almost instinctively, as if some part of them understood it was better not to linger. The road above it curved in a way that didn't make sense, as if the builders had carved it around something they didn't want to disturb. At its sharpest bend, the asphalt dipped ever so slightly, a shallow depression you could feel in your tires if you weren't paying attention. The guardrail there was rusted and low, a token gesture of protection that no one believed in. Troopers patrolling that stretch used to mutter about it on the radio, half jokes, half warnings. If the rain comes hard enough, the whole hill's gonna slide into the lake. It became a dark sort of folklore among officers. The missing mile, they called it. A place where roads forgot to hold steady. No one ever thought to connect it to Dana. Not seriously. The curve was outside her usual patrol range. The road was narrow, remote, and poorly lit. It didn't make sense for her to have driven it that night. And yet, in hindsight, it was exactly the kind of place that might swallow a car whole and leave no trace. After she vanished, the search teams had scouted the main highways, the wooded corridors, the gravel paths where she might have turned off. But County Route 6 was further out. It wasn't considered relevant. The lake beneath it wasn't deep, 30 feet at its lowest point, but it was murky, thick with algae, and filled with debris from decades of runoff. A body or vehicle submerged, there wouldn't be easy to see from above, especially not if no one was looking. The lake didn't have a recorded name until the early 60s. Before that, it was just known as the Hollow or the Basin. Old-timers said it had once been a quarry, left to flood and forgotten. There were stories, of course. Accidents. A boy who drowned in the 1,970 seconds. A couple who supposedly drove off the edge one foggy winter night. No proof, just stories passed around with a shrug, like campfire ash. Lake Revine earned its name from the township, not from anything beautiful. It wasn't a place for boats or birds. It was quiet, stagnant, almost stubborn in how it refused to change. Somewhere along that bend, in the years after Dana's disappearance, the brush had grown thick enough to obscure the slope. Storm after storm had loosened the earth, tugged at the shoulder, as if the land itself wanted to let go. But the road held barely. It wasn't until a boy casting for carp along the narrow, muddy shore threw his line and caught on something solid, something that refused to budge, that anyone looked beneath the surface. And even then, it took hours before someone thought to call the sheriff. By then, the guardrail had rusted through in several places. The signs along the road had faded to a dull gray. No one could remember the last time the county had inspected the bend. It had become one of those places you passed quickly, eyes forward, music up just a little louder than usual. But Dana Holt had driven that road once, for reasons no one could explain. And beneath it, Lake Ravine had waited. Still, dark, patient. It was an overcast afternoon in early spring when Caleb Mercer wandered down to Lake Ravine with his father's old tackle box and a borrowed rod. He was 15, restless, and looking for solitude in the kind of places adults had long since stopped bothering with. The lake had never been known for fishing. Its waters were murky and shallow near the banks, filled more with weeds and broken branches than anything worth catching. But that was partly why Caleb liked it. No crowds, no rules, just silence. He stood near the far bend, where the road arched above in a sloping curve. The shoreline was soft from recent rain, leaving his sneakers damp and coated in mud. He cast his line out lazily, more out of habit than expectation. The lake gave nothing, not even the satisfying resistance of a snag. It was a dead place, he thought. Nothing moved beneath the surface. It didn't even smell like water should. It smelled like stone, like metal left out too long in the weather. Then, on his third cast, the line caught. At first, he thought it was a log, the kind of driftwood that had soaked so long it barely floated. But when he pulled, there was weight. Not the writhing pull of fish, not the glide of weeds. This was solid, anchored, mechanical. He tightened the drag, reeled in with care. Something was resisting him, something unnatural. After a few minutes, the tip of a rust-colored frame began to break the surface jagged, out of place. Caleb dropped the rod and ran. The sheriff's office received the call just before 5. A vehicle, possibly submerged. Coordinates given by a breathless teenager and his skeptical father. At first, no one thought much of it. Maybe an old junker tossed down the slope by bored kids. Maybe something stolen years ago and forgotten. But when the first responders stepped to the water's edge and looked down through the tannin-dark surface, they saw it a shape too smooth, too deliberate, to be debris. The divers were called in the next morning. They moved slowly, the water clouded with silt and decay. Visibility was almost non-existent. One diver later described it as feeling like swimming through memory opaque and heavy. But then, emerging from the shadows below, the unmistakable outline of a car took form. Wheels half buried in the sediment, windows intact but clouded, and inside, barely visible through layers of time and algae, a body still seated upright behind the wheel. There were no dramatic moments, no cinematic rise to the surface, just the quiet coordination of men and women who had done this before, but rarely with such gravity. As the vehicle was winched from the lakebed, it creaked and groaned, water sloshing from every opening like breath returning to lungs long collapsed. The car's paint was nearly gone, eaten by time, but the shape remained unmistakable, a state patrol cruiser. And on the rear fender, just legible beneath layers of rust and silt, the number, 4032. The crowd that gathered remained hushed. No cheers, no gasps, just a shared understanding of what they were witnessing. A moment sealed in water, and now brought into light. Inside the vehicle, the remains were confirmed. Still wearing the uniform, still buckled in. Service weapon holstered. Dana Holt had never left that road. She had been waiting, unseen, in the arms of the lake for 4 long years. Caleb never fished again. He didn't have to. He had already pulled the only thing that mattered from those waters. Not a prize, not a story, but a truth too long buried. A mystery that had waited for someone to notice the way the surface didn't quite reflect what was underneath. The car broke the surface slowly, groaning under the strain of years spent underwater. Chains strained against rust-eaten metal, and the winch coughed as it dragged the weight upward, inch by inch. On the shore, no one spoke. The air was thick with fog, and something else, something older, more difficult to name. As if the lake, in surrendering its secret, demanded reverence. Dana's patrol cruiser emerged, coated in silt and algae. Green-brown strands draped across the windshield like strands of hair. The glass was intact but clouded, as if the water had pressed against it for so long it had left a memory of its pressure. Moss clung to the door handles. The side mirrors were missing. The tires sagged on the rims, half-rotted but still recognizable. It was like pulling a memory from a grave, preserved in mud and time. Inside the vehicle, the outline of a figure remained. Dana had been there the entire time, seatbelt fastened across her chest. Posture slumped forward slightly, but not violently. Her hands rested in her lap. Her service weapon was still secured in its holster, untouched. The radio mic hung loose from its hook, trailing against the floor mat, as if waiting to be used one last time. There was no shattered glass, no bent steering column, no signs of panic or struggle, just stillness frozen in place. The forensic team moved carefully. The door creaked open, releasing a slow, gurgling breath of lake water. The scent was overpowering rot, earth, rust, and time, but no one flinched. They had seen death before, but not like this. This was something different. This was the echo of an unanswered question finally speaking back. Her body, or what remained of it, showed no external trauma. No broken bones, no bullet wounds, no sign of restraint. Her clothes, though worn by water, remained largely intact, patches of the uniform still visible beneath algae and decay. Her boots were still laced. Her name tag, Holt, barely legible under a smear of sediment, clung to her chest like a final word. The medical examiner's report would later confirm it. No evidence of foul play. No drugs. No signs of drowning either, not in the traditional sense. The leading theory: blunt force trauma from the car's descent. Sudden submersion, lack of oxygen. But there were no definitive answers. Only a declaration of death by accidental means, with the caveat that some truths couldn't be recovered. People wanted more. They wanted violence, a villain, a reason. But the car offered none. No brake marks on the slope above. No anomalies in the steering. The headlights had been off. The ignition key still turned in the slot. Everything intact, everything quiet. It was the quiet that unnerved people most. No final call, no recorded cry for help. Just the fading words from 4 years earlier, 10 to 10. "I'll be out of service for a while," echoing now like a whisper beneath 1,000 gallons of still water. Some said she must have fallen asleep at the wheel. Others believed she had followed someone off the road. But no one could explain the complete absence of disruption. No panic, no skid, no visible attempt to escape. It was as if she had simply continued forward, into the dark, into the lake, with the same calm resolve she had carried through every patrol. And as the tow truck pulled her cruiser onto solid ground, its tires dragging a trail of lakebed behind them, those who watched could feel the years folding in on themselves. The missing posters, the search parties, the nights spent listening for footsteps that never came, all of it collapsed into that one silent moment when Dana Holt was found not in chaos, but in peace. Sealed in glass, surrounded by echoes that never had the chance to be heard. The examination began with gloves and silence. The air in the lab was chilled, clinical, but the weight of what had been pulled from Lake Revine still hung in every corner. Dana Holt's remains arrived, sealed and fragile. Her uniform now, more fabric memory than fabric function. Her badge rusted but recognizable. Her body, submerged for 4 years, was no longer a body in the conventional sense. It had become a conversation between time and water, softened, reshaped, worn down to its most elemental truths. The autopsy was meticulous. It had to be. The case had lived too long in the space between rumor and fact, and now, at last, science would have its say. The medical examiner, a seasoned woman who had handled her share of cold cases, approached the process not as closure, but as invitation. She knew better than to expect certainty. Especially here. The first findings were expected. The tissue was consistent with prolonged submersion. No signs of blunt force trauma. No ligature marks. No contusions or broken bones. Her skull was intact. No hemorrhaging, no defensive wounds. Her teeth, surprisingly, had survived well, enamel holding up against the slow, cold erosion. There were no traces of illicit substances in her blood. What little was still recoverable. No alcohol. No prescription drugs. Nothing to suggest she'd been impaired, disoriented, or unaware of her surroundings that night. Inside the vehicle, everything told the same story. The seatbelt was locked in place, suggesting she hadn't tried to flee or brace herself. Her weapon was untouched, holstered securely at her side. Her flashlight was found in the passenger footwell. The dashboard clock had long stopped, its digital face dark. But her watch, worn on her left wrist beneath the deteriorated cuff of her uniform, had frozen in time. 2:17 a.m. That detail held more weight than expected. Her last radio check-in had been at 1:46 a.m. when she uttered the phrase that had haunted the investigation for years, 10 to 10. I'll be out of service for a while. Roughly 30 minutes later, the watch stopped. Impact, most likely. Water pressure. Perhaps the moment the vehicle first kissed the bottom of the lake bed, its tires settling into the silt like anchors. But why had she been there in the first place? That question remained untouched. Investigators combed through the vehicle again, this time with forensic precision. Every inch photographed, catalogued, studied. The floor mats had long since fused with mildew. Her logbook was bloated, the ink smudged into illegibility. A receipt from a gas station dated the day before her disappearance was tucked between the seats. No sign of a struggle, no sign of a second person. No scratches on the door frame, no hair samples that didn't match, just dust, mold, and the eerie serenity of a car that had died as quietly as the person within it. The final report cited accidental death, probable loss of control, a combination of low visibility, fatigue, and a dangerous curve. It made sense on paper, but in the quiet rooms of the department, among those who had known Dana not just as a trooper but as a woman, there was unease. She knew those roads. She didn't lose control. And she didn't go off-road without reason. The lack of evidence was its own kind of message, one that said, nothing happened. But that couldn't be right. Something had made her stop. Something had taken her off her path. Something had led her to that road, that lake, at that time, and left no trace of itself behind. Maybe it was a simple misjudgment. A moment of fatigue. A second of distraction. But then there was the voice on the radio, measured and calm. 10 to 10, I'll be out of service for a while. Spoken like a decision, not an accident, not a mistake. Forensics told the story of how Dana died. But not why. Not what she saw in the minutes between her last check-in and the moment her watch stopped ticking. Not what she thought as the headlights dimmed beneath the water, and the world above continued without her. They called it the silent curve now. A bend in the road so ordinary it had once escaped notice entirely, now etched with the weight of memory. The stretch of County Route 6 above Lake Ravine hadn't changed in the years since Dana disappeared. The guardrail was still rusted, sagging at its weakest point. The slope leading down to the water was still cloaked in brush, steep enough to be dangerous, not steep enough to be obvious. There were no skid marks, no gouged earth. Just that soft depression in the curve, subtle, deceptive, that leaned just enough to tempt gravity. Investigators returned there in 2003, not with urgency this time, but with solemn purpose. The car had been recovered, the autopsy complete, and the question now turned to the moment of loss. What happened in the last seconds before the cruiser left the road? They brought reconstruction specialists, reenacted the drive at night under similar weather conditions. Dana's original route didn't include that road, but if she'd taken a detour, perhaps chasing a tip, perhaps distracted, they needed to understand how such a detour became final. They drove the curve at varying speeds, placed temporary markers at each inch of shoulder, simulated tire blowouts, overcorrections, sudden braking. Nothing produced a clear answer. The most consistent theory was the simplest: a miscalculated turn. Night fog had been dense that evening, a low-hanging haze that hugged the hills and warped headlights into ghostly halos. If Dana had entered that curve just a little too fast, especially with tired eyes and a long shift behind her, it was conceivable her vehicle slipped. Add in the slight incline and the worn pavement, no friction, no resistance. Just forward momentum and a drop cloaked in shadow. But that didn't sit right with everyone. Dana knew that road. She'd driven it during training runs, during winter checks, during late-night loops when other units needed backup coverage. She had commented once, during a routine maintenance report, about the bend above the lake, noting its lack of reflective paint and the angle of the shoulder. It was a red flag minor, buried in paperwork, but she had seen the risk long before she vanished into it. And then there was the matter of her speed. The vehicle's onboard diagnostics, what little could be salvaged, suggested she hadn't been speeding. No signs of sudden acceleration. No evidence of braking. If she lost control, it hadn't been from panic. It had been quiet, smooth, almost intentional. One of the investigators, a younger detective, new to the department, walked the stretch alone late one afternoon. He traced her likely path, from where she would have entered the bend to where her car would have left the pavement. He stood there for a long while, eyes fixed on the lake below. When he returned to the others, he said nothing, but later, in his notes, he wrote, "Feels like she followed something." That phrase lingered, because nothing in the data suggested pursuit. No flagged vehicles, no suspect activity. But Dana didn't just veer off roads for no reason. She didn't lose focus. If she turned down that stretch of Route 6, it was because something led her there. A sound, a figure, a hunch, or maybe something more private. Something she never told anyone. And yet, the official line remained unchanged. An unfortunate accident caused by limited visibility and fatigue. A tragedy, yes, but nothing more. The curve would be repaired eventually. The guardrail replaced. The report filed and shelved. But those who stood at that bend, who looked down into the place where the lake had hidden her for 4 silent years, knew better. There was something in the stillness there, not just memory, but suggestion. A feeling that even now, the road was holding its breath, waiting, watching. As if the answers were still just out of sight, suspended in fog, and the long echo of what could never be explained. Long after the headlines faded and the investigation was officially closed, the town of Ellison still talked about Dana Holt. Not loudly, not often, but with the low murmur of unresolved truth, passed in grocery store aisles, over diner coffee, on front porches when the light began to fail. The return of her body had answered the question of where, but not the one that mattered most. Why? In those lingering silences, the rumors grew. They said she had been chasing someone that night. That her voice on the radio measured, calm, masked something more urgent. One shop owner claimed he'd heard from a cousin in the department that Dana had been investigating a separate case, off the books, something tied to missing women across the county. A waitress swore she saw Dana at 1:30 a.m. parked along the county line, speaking with a man who wasn't in uniform. No one could verify either story. No one tried too hard. The most persistent whisper was about the tracks. A retired highway worker, who'd been part of the initial road crew dispatched after Dana's disappearance, recalled seeing faint tire marks near the slope above Lake Ravine. Narrow, unaligned, as if someone had parked just short of the guardrail and then left. He wasn't sure. He hadn't documented it. But he remembered the feeling that he was looking at something important, and no one else seemed to notice. Maybe they had been there before her. Maybe after. Then there was the boy, barely 10 at the time, who told his mother he saw a flashlight moving through the trees across from their property the night Dana went missing. A slow, deliberate beam, not like the erratic flickers of kids or drifters. Purposeful. His mother dismissed it until the cruiser was pulled from the lake 4 years later, just a mile from their house. No evidence ever surfaced to support these claims. But facts became secondary to the story. Because what else explained how a trained trooper, composed and cautious, veered off her known route into an unlit bend above a lake she rarely patrolled? What would make her abandon protocol, silence her radio, drive a road she knew was dangerous, unless someone else was there? There were those who insisted she'd been lured. That her calm voice, 10 to 10, "I'll be out of service for a while," was code. A cry for help disguised as routine. One that slipped past dispatch and into obscurity. A few believed she was pushed. That another vehicle had forced her off the road, leaving no skid marks, no taillights caught on camera, just a clean erasure of her existence. Even now, if you ask the right people in town, they'll tell you she wasn't alone that night. That someone walked that curve just before her, that she saw them. Maybe tried to stop them, maybe followed. And maybe that's why she never came back. The guardrail has since been repaired, the slope reinforced, but the ground there still feels uncertain, too soft in places, as if the earth remembers what it once tried to hide. People drive slower now. They glance into the trees as they round the bend, imagining headlights in the mirror, a figure by the roadside, a shadow crossing the lane. What happened on that stretch of road is no longer a matter of police record. It's folklore, myth dressed in uniform. And like all stories born from silence, it refuses to stay buried. It lingers, just beneath the surface, waiting, whispering, never quite letting go. In the dimly lit archive room of the Ellison County Sheriff's Department, the old dispatch tapes were stored in a row of gray boxes, labeled by date and shift. They had long since been digitized, of course, but the originals were kept out of habit, or reverence, or the unspoken fear that digital files could be erased in ways magnetic tape could not. It was there, months after Dana Holt's vehicle was pulled from Lake Ravine, that a technician reviewing archive transmissions stumbled on something that had been overlooked. The dispatch log from the night Dana disappeared was, at first glance, unremarkable. Her last official check-in had been at 1:46 a.m., 10 to 10. "I'll be out of service for a while," followed by a block of static that had always been attributed to poor reception in the foothills. For years, that was the end of it. No further transmissions, no anomalies. Just silence. But when the technician played the tape again, carefully cleaning the heads of the machine and adjusting the pitch to account for degradation, he noticed something strange. The silence wasn't clean. It wasn't the white noise of a dead channel. It was interrupted briefly by something sharper. A glitch, at first. A skipping sound. But not random. It occurred precisely 15 seconds after Dana's final transmission. A jagged burst of static, followed by what could have been a word. Cut off, mangled. A syllable, a breath. Then nothing. The official log hadn't recorded it. The digital version had smoothed over the break, filled the gap with uniform static. But the tape caught it. Something was said. Or someone said something to her. The department reanalyzed her GPS logs. The data, though fragmented, offered a ghostly trace of her movements that night. Her last confirmed ping had come from Route 7, consistent with her known patrol route. But a second ping dismissed during the initial investigation due to its imprecision suggested her cruiser had traveled south by southeast, skirting the back edge of County Route 6. The timestamp aligned closely with her final transmission. That ping placed her within a mile of Lake Ravine. The location didn't make sense. It wasn't on her beat. It wasn't in the logbook. The road itself was unlit, narrow, prone to fog. A place she had once described as structurally compromised in an internal note following a routine patrol inspection. Speculation bloomed again. If she had gone off route, was it voluntary? Was she following a vehicle, chasing a lead? Had she been called there by someone using a different frequency? And if so, why had none of that made it into the log? The missing dispatch tape became its own small legend. A piece of sound too incomplete to decipher, yet too strange to ignore. Audio technicians from the state were brought in. Filters were applied, waveforms enhanced, but no clear words emerged. Just that brief, jagged edge in the silence, like something tearing through cloth, something trying to be heard. And then swallowed. Years later, some officers would still revisit that tape during quiet shifts. Sit alone in the dark, headset on, listening not for what was said, but for what wasn't. For the space between the crackle. For the second, Dana might have hesitated, or spoken, or realized. Some believed she'd been intercepted. That the voice, if it was a voice, had come from someone close. Not a stranger. Someone she trusted enough to follow. Others thought it might have been her, trying to say something more before the lake took her. But whatever message had been trapped in that sliver of static had long since slipped out of reach. Gone, like the signal that night. Gone, like Dana herself, into a place beyond the record. Beyond the sound. Beyond retrieval. The locker hadn't been opened in years. Not really opened. Not with intent. After Dana's disappearance, it had become something sacred, sealed out of respect. Her mother had requested it remain untouched, and for a time, the department obliged. A quiet metal tomb behind steel slats, undisturbed. But after the discovery at Lake Ravine, after her body had been recovered, the cruiser dragged from the depths, and the last fragments of her case, scattered across reports and whispered speculation. An order came down to catalog her personal effects. Procedure, closure. No one volunteered. In the end, it was Officer Fields who did it. The same man who had once trained with her, who had known her laugh, who had waited at the rest stop for her to return. The locker was mostly what you'd expect. A second pair of boots, an extra flashlight with dying batteries, a weathered copy of a departmental manual, spine cracked, dog-eared in parts, a few protein bars, expired, and at the very bottom, wedged behind a manila folder stuffed with shift schedules and citations, was a notebook soft-covered, green, and wrapped with a rubber band that had long since gone brittle. Inside were pages of Dana's handwriting, dense, purposeful, notes from traffic stops, case observations, personal reminders, scattered thoughts that, at first glance, seemed routine. But then, toward the back, a folded sheet of paper caught Fields's eye. It wasn't from the notebook. Different paper, different ink, hand-drawn. It was a map. Not official, not printed. A sketch rough, but unmistakably specific. County lines marked out in careful strokes. Major highways, local roads, and in darker ink, certain areas boxed in with heavy outlines. 4 locations circled, each one tied to a disappearance. Janice Marlowe, Alyssa Drake. Angela Kepner, Megan Albright. Dana had written their names in the margins. Dates too. Disappearance windows. Approximate last known locations. And then, toward the bottom right of the map, along the bend near County Route 6, a 5th mark smaller, fainter. A cross, not a circle. No name, no date. Just a phrase, scribbled in tight cursive near the margin. Where they go missing. Fields stared at it for a long time. He remembered Dana working late shifts in the months before she vanished. Remembered her pushing paperwork harder than usual, following up on cases no longer active. She hadn't talked about it, but she hadn't needed to. She carried the tension like a second uniform, focused, quiet, like someone looking for something she couldn't quite name. She had seen a pattern. Before anyone else. Before the community whispered it. Before the press buried it under newer tragedies. Dana had started to connect the dots. She hadn't taken it to her superiors. There was no formal report, no case file linked to the map. Whatever she was building, she was doing it alone. Had she followed a lead that night? Chased something off-grid, off-protocol? Had someone known she was getting close? The existence of the map changed nothing officially. The file on Dana's death remained closed, accidental, unintentional, final. But for those who read her notes, who trace the inked lines from one vanished woman to the next, who stared at the words where they go missing and felt the weight of Dana's quiet suspicion, there was no longer any comfort in calling it a mistake. She had gone to that curve for a reason. Months before the lake took her, she had drawn its shape into her notebook. She had known, or at least suspected. She had followed something into the dark, and what she left behind was not just a map, but a warning. One nobody saw in time. The first time she dreamed of Dana, it was winter. Snow covered the porch steps, just like the night she disappeared. In the dream, Dana stood at the front door, still in uniform, her boots caked with slush, her eyes tired but kind. She didn't speak, she didn't have to. Her mother opened the door, and Dana stepped inside, the scent of cold air and damp wool trailing behind her. They sat at the kitchen table in silence. No words, just presence. A quiet understanding that she was home. Elaine Holt woke from that dream with her heart pounding. For a brief, fragile second, she believed it had really happened. She reached for her robe, called out her daughter's name down the hallway. But the house answered only with creaks and emptiness. That morning, she didn't make coffee. She sat in the stillness for hours, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen again. She was out there, Elaine said during an interview, recorded months after Dana's remains were found. Her voice was soft, but unwavering. I knew it. I just didn't know where. The reporter had expected tears, maybe raw grief. But Elaine's sorrow had calcified into something deeper. She didn't cry easily anymore. Instead, her voice carried the weight of all the hours spent hoping, then doubting, then hoping again. There was no ceremony in her pain, just the daily repetition of absence. I didn't change the locks, she continued. Not once. Her key was still in her purse when they found her, but I didn't know that then. I just thought, what if she comes back and can't get in? She smiled, but it wasn't joy, it was habit. A worn expression used to soften things that hurt too much to speak plainly. Elaine had kept Dana's room just as it was. The photos on the dresser, the stack of books by the window, the police academy certificate framed above the desk. For 4 years, dust gathered in careful layers. Occasionally, she would enter and open the windows, letting in air and a sliver of light. But she never stayed long. The room had stopped being a place of comfort. It had become a shrine one she couldn't bear to dismantle, even after the truth surfaced from the lake. I didn't believe she ran, she said, eyes focused somewhere beyond the recorder. People said that. They said maybe she left on purpose, that she got tired, that something broke in her. But I knew my daughter, she didn't run. If she had something to face, she faced it. The dreams continued, even after the discovery. Some were quieter now, fainter. Dana no longer stood at the door. Sometimes she was in the passenger seat of the car during long, imagined drives. Sometimes she was on the front lawn, standing in the fog, just out of reach. Elaine would call to her, and Dana would smile, but she never answered. In one of the final recordings, Elaine speaks almost in a whisper. They told me it was peaceful, that she didn't suffer. But I don't know what peace looks like when a car sinks through the dark and no one sees. I don't think I'll ever really understand what happened. But I know she didn't disappear. Not to me. She was just waiting to be found. The tape clicks softly as the interview ends. Outside, the wind moves through the trees in slow gusts, the kind that sound like breath through parted lips. And inside that small house on the edge of town, a porch light still burns through the night. Not because Dana will walk up those steps again, but because some part of her mother still believes against reason, against time, against death, that a knock might come, that a door might open, that a voice once lost to silence might return. There's a certain kind of road that doesn't show up in maps the way it shows up in memory. It winds through places you don't name, between trees that seem too tall, too quiet, bending overhead like watchmen who've grown tired of warning anyone. County Route 6 was one of those roads, narrow, cracked, and lined in places by little more than weathered posts and rusted steel. A suggestion of a guardrail, not a promise. The kind of road you take when you're not meant to be seen. The kind of road that lets you disappear without much effort at all. For Dana Holt, that stretch of pavement became more than a waypoint. It became a passage, though no one knew at the time. It was where her path blurred, not just from the road, but from the world itself. One moment she was a state trooper on routine patrol. The next, she was a question buried under 4 years of still water and silt. Her car had followed the curve, her tires had kissed the edge. And then the earth simply let go. In the weeks after the discovery, people returned to the bend. Locals, officers, journalists, with cameras that only knew how to frame a story, not feel it. They stood there, looking down at the place where Dana had been swallowed whole. And all of them, in one way or another, saw the same thing. A road without boundaries, a path unguarded. Not just physically, but spiritually. The symbolism was inescapable. Dana's life had been built on structure, law, duty, the hard lines of training and policy. She was someone who obeyed the rules, who made order out of other people's chaos. And yet the road that took her offered none of that. It was loose gravel, thin asphalt, a place that turned the rules of traction and visibility into rumors. In that way, it mirrored the quiet erosion of certainty that followed her vanishing. The longer she was gone, the more the boundaries blurred between fact and supposition, between evidence and myth. Was it fatigue that night? Was it instinct? Did she turn down that road in pursuit or in reflection? No one could say. But the road became a metaphor for everything unsaid. A liminal space between the known and the unknowable. Between a voice on the radio and a watch that stopped at 2:17 a.m. Between the living and the lost. And what of the guardrails? They were there, yes, but barely. Rusted beams bolted into soft soil. One officer said you could lean on them and feel the give. They weren't meant to hold back real momentum, just to signal where the road ended and risk began. But what happens when someone doesn't stop? When they slip past the threshold, not just of steel and gravel, but of safety and sense? When the world, for a moment, forgets to catch them? Dana's death wasn't loud. It didn't come with sirens or skidding brakes. It was quiet. The kind of ending you don't notice until long after it's passed. And in that quiet, the road lives on not just as a place of tragedy, but as a symbol of that thin line we all travel without thinking. The one between arrival and absence, between who we are and what we become when no one's watching. The road remains. It curves without apology. It carries cars every day now, just as it did then. But those who know, those who remember, slow down at that bend. They look to the left, toward the lake below, and for a moment, feel what it means to follow a path without guardrails. To ride the edge of something unspeakable, and to know that once, a woman named Dana Holt drove that road and never returned. The file was marked closed in bold, unfeeling type. Case number 99-4032. Cause of death: accidental submersion resulting in asphyxiation. Circumstantial factors: low visibility, road conditions, driver fatigue. It was the final entry in a long and uneven record, years in the making, pieced together from fragments of silence and the brittle edge of supposition. And with that single designation, the disappearance of Trooper Dana Holt was no longer a mystery in the eyes of the law. It was an accident, tragic, but explainable. An event with a beginning, a middle, and now, an official end. But for those who had lived with her absence, who had memorized the lines of her photograph and traced the shape of her name across 1,000 sleepless nights, the ending didn't settle. It didn't satisfy. The paperwork might have offered resolution, but it didn't offer clarity. Something remained, hovering, weightless but immovable. A sense that more had gone into that lake than just a patrol car and the woman inside it. The reports were clinical. A full timeline of her final known movements. The radio transmission, parsed and replayed. The analysis of the crash site. The weather records from that night. Everything pointed to the probable, an exhausted officer, perhaps distracted, taking a wrong turn onto a dangerous stretch of road. A misjudged bend. A fatal drop into dark water. It was all plausible. Believable. Neat. But life is rarely neat, and Dana Holt had not been a careless person. In every retelling, in every hallway conversation long after the file was shelved, that fact persisted. Dana had been methodical, measured, a creature of habit and discipline. She didn't take detours without logging them. She didn't drive roads she had already flagged as unsafe without reason. She didn't leave her partner hanging or miss a check-in unless something had gone deeply wrong. The autopsy found no trace of violence, no toxins, no red flags. But it also didn't explain why she was there, why she never called in distress, why she'd buckled her seatbelt, switched off her headlights, and slid quietly beneath the water as if disappearing had been part of the plan. No answers came from the map in her locker, the faint circled names, or the phrase she had scribbled, "Where they go missing." Those clues lingered like the smell of old rain present, undeniable, but impossible to hold. Some believed she had gotten too close to something, that she'd uncovered a connection between disappearances and had followed it into a shadow that eventually consumed her. Others dismissed it, said grief made people see patterns that weren't there, said mysteries are often nothing more than the accumulation of coincidences we don't want to accept. And yet, those who stood by the lake where her cruiser had been found, who had stared into its murky depths and imagined what it must have felt like to sink into that cold stillness, knew that some part of the truth remained down there, something unsaid, something unseen, something that hadn't floated up with the car. Closure came in the form of a funeral, a folded flag, a slow march. Dana's badge number read aloud over a radio frequency one final time. A moment of silence held across the department, across the state. Her mother received the call. Her colleagues sent flowers. Her photograph, once pinned to the missing board, was moved to a wall of remembrance backlit, framed in solemn brass. But clarity never came. It clung to the case like fog to the lake at dawn, thick and persistent, refusing to lift. Even years later, in the quiet moments when officers drove that same road, or when her name was mentioned over coffee, a pause would follow. A hesitation, as if some part of them still waited for the real ending. The true explanation, the missing piece that would make sense of it all. But all they had was water. And silence. And the faint echo of a voice on the radio. The memorial sits just off the shoulder of County Route 6, a few feet from where the old guardrail gives way to the steep slope above Lake Revine. It's simple. A white wooden cross, weathered by seasons, its paint beginning to chip in places where the wind hits hardest. At its center, nailed with care, is a framed photograph of Dana Holt, her uniform crisp, her expression calm. Not smiling, exactly, but composed like she knew what the job demanded and chose to bear it anyway. At the base of the cross, someone has left fresh flowers. Daffodils this time, though they've already begun to bend in the afternoon sun, their stems softening, petals curling at the edges. A laminated badge dangles from a ribbon tied around the post, fluttering slightly in the breeze. It reads 4032, her number. The one called out that final time over the radio, followed by silence. There is no plaque, no engraved explanation, just her name, the dates, and a line written in faint permanent marker. You were never just a voice on the radio. The town didn't organize the memorial. It started with her mother, who stood alone on that roadside one morning not long after the funeral, pressing the first post into the earth with shaking hands. Others followed. Former colleagues, quiet sympathizers, strangers who had read her story and felt its weight settle in their chests like river stones. They left tokens, letters in Ziploc bags, worn patches from other departments, prayer beads, cigarette lighters, one small pair of child's shoes with no note at all. No one removed them. The lake kept its distance, it always had. From the top of the slope, the water looks almost beautiful, smooth and reflective, like a pane of glass laid over memory. You wouldn't know what it held. You wouldn't guess that for 4 years, a state trooper's cruiser rested beneath its surface, sealed in shadow, time suspended inside steel and silence. The ripples betray nothing. The lake never speaks. People still drive past the curve slowly, not always out of fear, sometimes out of respect, sometimes because they can't help but look. They glance toward the water, to the place where the road seems to hesitate before bending out of view. It's not marked on any map as a site of tragedy, but everyone around here knows what happened. Or rather, what was never truly explained. Dana Holt remains a presence more than a memory. Her story is recounted in low voices, in classrooms for new recruits, in quiet conversations between mothers and daughters before a night shift begins. She is a caution, a symbol, but also something softer, a reminder of dedication, of mystery, of the kind of silence that leaves a permanent shape in the world. The lake hasn't changed. It reflects the sky just the same, takes the wind without protest, holds the cold well into spring. But for those who know what to look for, there's something else in its stillness. Not just sorrow, not just loss. Something waiting. And in that final image, the water unmoving, the cross leaning slightly, the flowers beginning to fade, we are left with the truth that can't be written in case files or stitched into ceremony. That some endings don't answer, some roads don't return, some names are never truly lost. Only carried, gently, by the places that remember them.